Horowitz, it's been a long day. I think you're going on 7 hours here with very little respite from that, but I think you've handled yourself well, and we very much appreciate that. You know, at the beginning of this hearing, I posed the question, why should Americans care about what we're talking about here today? And unfortunately, I think we heard from some of our members that we don't care about these emails anymore. We don't care about these GD emails and texts, I assume they're referring to as well, from Mr. Struck and Ms. Page. But I'd like everyone here to think about, what if the shoe was on their foot? What if high-ranking people in the nation's most important law enforcement organization were talking about an investigation into them, and they showed that kind of animus, that kind of bias in the process? You, Mr. Horowitz, have a number of times today made it very clear that you understand how important it is that the American people have the assurance that when it comes to the enforcement of our laws, that justice is blind, and that the guarantee of our Constitution of equality under the law for all people is fulfilled. I don't think we can say that here right now, unfortunately, about this very sorry circumstance. And we're going to continue to pursue this until we have the assurance that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice have cleaned house and are making the necessary changes to ensure that in the future, whether it's the 2020 presidential election or whether it's Jane Doe or Joe Smith's criminal investigation, that they will indeed experience equality under the law, and the kind of extreme bias that we've seen in looking at some of the most prominent investigations in American history will not happen again.
Now investigated enough and lived enough to know that this is a circumstance that has never happened before. We're criminally investigating one of the candidates for president of the United States. President Obama's comments obviously weighed on me as well. You've got the president who has already said there's no there there. And so all of that creates a situation where how do you get out of this without grievous damage to the institution?
Mr. Horowitz, I have a statement and then a quick question. I go home to Kentucky every weekend, and when I'm home, I'm talking to a lot of people all across the state. My district's very vast, from one state to the other. When we're home during recess, I talk to a lot of people. The biggest complaint that I hear from the good, hardworking people in my congressional district in southern Kentucky is the disgusting news that they've seen about the obvious bias from the F.B.I. and from the investigators, and it leads in to people's minds exactly what the president's been saying, that this is a witch hunt. Yep. This is a witch hunt, that every time they turn on the television, there's news about the Russia investigation, very little news on certain media outlets about the things that obviously Hillary Clinton did that were illegal.
And I guess my question at this point is, we've sent you a letter asking for copies of the original draft, any alterations made, edits, red lines, and hope that we can get that from you. I want to go to, is there a chance we're going to get any of that information from you?
What I'd like to do is we normally do, and I like to do, is engage with you and the committee about it. I understand the concern. I want to talk it through with you and the other members who signed the letter, and the chairs and the ranking member, and have a candid discussion about it.
Love to do that. We can do that offline.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, from what I see right here, I have a problem with what just took place on this. The gentleman asked if he could see a copy of the report in its raw stage, meaning before any changes were made and things were changed out. And Horowitz wants to talk to these guys, I assume from the way they're acting, in a private setting. And this is not transparency. This is more of backroom deals that we as Americans should have a real big problem with, because that's not how it works. The Congress should have a full copy, and I don't mean just their guys up there. I mean, it should be open for anyone to look into as well. So I think this is kind of a bullshit deal there.
Director Comey clearly departed from FBI and department norms, and his decisions negatively impacted the perception of the FBI and the department as fair administrators of justice. Director Comey concealed from the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General his intention to make a unilateral announcement in July 2016 about the reasons for his recommendation not to prosecute former Secretary Clinton. His July 5th statement included inappropriate commentary about uncharged conduct, announced his views on what a quote-unquote reasonable prosecutor would do, and served to confuse rather than clarify public understanding of his recommendation or what the prosecutors had assessed in terms of the evidence.
Okay, now what Horowitz just said damns Comey. It basically puts him in a box, and if Mueller wants to use him as a so-called witness, I think his credibility, it just went out the window.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, is recognized.
Mr. Horowitz, does Peter Strzok like the president?
I can only speak to what his text messages say, and they're obviously not positive comments about the president.
February, March of 2016, Peter Strzok said, Trump's abysmal, Trump's an idiot, he's a bleeping idiot, Hillary should win 100 million to 0. Sounds to me like he hates the president.
His text messages would certainly leave that as the implication.
Your report says Strzok ran the Clinton investigation on a daily basis. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
And Peter Strzok, in your report, he was the lead investigator on the Russian investigation. Is that true?
That's my understanding for the time period he was on.
So the guy, he ran the Clinton investigation, he runs the Russian investigation, and he hates the president, but your report says while his bias cast a cloud, it didn't impact final decisions. Is that accurate?
It didn't impact the prosecutor's final decision.
Right. Let's look at a few other things Peter Strzok had to say. On May 4th, 2016, the day after President Trump secures the Republican nomination, Mr. Strzok says, now the pressure really starts to finish the Clinton investigation. I'm not sure why the pressure would be more or less the day after. It seems to me you want to just do the investigation. On July 31st, as mentioned earlier, the FBI opens the Russian investigation. 1 week later, Peter Strzok says, I can protect my country on many levels. 2 days after that, he says, we will stop Trump. 1 week after that, he says, no way he gets elected. It's like an insurance policy. So think about this, Mr. Horowitz. Peter Strzok opens, the FBI opens the Russia investigation on July 31st, 2016. Peter Strzok is the lead investigator. Within the next 15 days, he says, I can protect my country on many levels. No way he gets elected. We will stop him. We have an insurance policy. Now that seems like, at least I think a lot of regular folks would interpret that as more than just casting a cloud on what the FBI ultimately did. I mean, it's one thing to say Trump's an idiot. It's another thing to say we got an insurance policy. It's one thing to say Trump's awful. It's another thing to say we're going to stop him. Especially when those statements are made within 15 days, just days after you've launched an investigation into that individual. Would you agree?
And I think the important thing here is the time period we're talking about, because those messages in the July-August period, which we found extremely concerning and antithetical to core values of the FBI, concerned, as we noted, the Russia investigation, and as you noted, and that's why we had so much concern about what occurred in late September and October.
Exactly. Mr. Horowitz, was Peter Strzok put on Special Counsel Mueller's team?
He was.
So again, just to, the guy who hates the president, the guy who ran the Clinton investigation, the guy who ran the Russian investigation, then gets assigned to the Special Counsel team. Do you know what? Do you know what date, Mr. Horowitz, the Special Counsel was named?
I believe it was around May 17th.
May 17th, 2017. May 17th, 2017. Mr. Horowitz, do you remember what Peter Strzok said on May 18th, 2017?
I do. It's in our report on page 405.
I unleashed it on the mid-year exam, this one.
Yes.
Now I need to fix it and finish it. There's unfinished business, and this could be an investigation leading to impeachment. That's what he said the day after.
Correct.
Again, don't you think that sounds and looks a little bit like to regular Americans, a little bit more than just casting a cloud on the overall investigations?
Again, I'd go back to what the report concerned, which was the Clinton email investigation, which was concluded about a year earlier with Director Comey's announcement. But it's precisely why we were concerned about what occurred in late September and October, when Mr. Strzok had the choice between working on the Russia investigation or on the Wiener laptop Clinton investigation.
He would prioritize the one over the other.
Chose Russia.
Yeah. Let me just finish with this. And this is probably what bothers me. More than all what we just went through. More than that, probably what bothers me the most is Peter Strzok's attitude. I think it's what bothers Americans the most about this whole ordeal. I just want to go to one more text message one more thing Mr. Strzok said. This is back in that August time period again. August 26, 2016, Peter Strzok says, just went to a Southern Virginia Walmart. I can smell the Trump supporters. This is what ticks Americans off more than anything else, I'm convinced, about all this in Clinton investigation, all this Russian investigation, is this idea that there are two sets of rules or two standards. One set of rules for us regular folk who shop at Walmart, but a different set if your name is Clinton, Comey, Lynch, McCabe, or if your name is Peter Strzok. And the arrogance and the condescension and the elitist attitude, that is what ticks people off. And as they look at all this and see what Strzok said throughout these investigations, that's why their confidence is so shaken, and frankly, that's why they're so mad. And that's why we got to get some answers from Mr. Rosenstein and Mr. Ray about this whole ordeal. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Jim Jordan is one smart son of a gun. He just nailed it big time, and that IG report is just full of biasness by the FBI and the D.O.J. and all of their top leaders. You know, the funny thing is when Trump took office, I tweeted out to him almost immediately he needed to fire the top 15 or 25 in every agency, because I knew there was a bunch of holdovers from both the Bush, the Clinton, and Obama administration. And they liked the way the swamp was being run because they all got their little fingers in the pie. So America, if you want to help Trump, you better get out there and vote. And make sure you unseat these Democrats, because this shit's been going on long before Trump came in. I think they've been controlling our elections for a long time, going back decades.
Any actions on the subjects that you have on the people in there?
Director Ray testified yesterday that he had provided our information and report to the FBI's Office of Congressional Responsibility.
I see. Thank you so much for your responses. And at this time, Jim, I'm going to yield my remaining time to the gentlewoman from Texas.
Gentlelady recognized for 33 seconds.
Mr. Director, excuse me, Mr. Horowitz, did you investigate any questions about Mr. Rosenstein's actions in your report as it relates to any inappropriate behavior?
No.
I didn't hear you, sir.
No.
And did you, let us finish the question that I had dealing with the FBI agents in the Southern District of New York. You did confirm that they leaked, is that not correct?
We did not say anything at all about whether they leaked or didn't leak. We're not speaking or speak at all to who we were looking at or what we're looking at, other than we're looking at the issues we were asked to look at about investigative leaks.
And so you will continue that investigation?
We will.
All right, thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Goldberg, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, there has been a massive amount of bias documented by you in your investigation. You concluded with recommendations that appear to just be more policies of the same policies with the FBI, the DOJ already had. You understood it was already against FBI, DOJ policy to let bias come into play in these investigations, correct?
Absolutely.
Well, you made references in your report, even quoted from unnamed but numbered prosecutors and agents. Have you given us the names of those individuals?
So we have a request for them, and we are...
So you haven't given us the names, and now you can't decide whether you're going to give them to us?
No, well, let me be clear. We engaged the committee on this. We went to the FBI. The FBI raised a concern.
The answer is no, you haven't given them to us. So let me just tell you, we're here because prosecutors and agents at the DOJ have been biased, and it may have, and some of us believe you've laid out a case that bias did affect what was going on, and then you come in here and say, we're going to number these people. We're not going to let you know who they are. But let me ask you this. Have you checked to see what normally wouldn't matter, how they voted in a presidential election, except when you're investigating a nominee or a president? Do you know how they voted? Did they donate money to either of the candidates?
I have no idea how they voted, and I don't
so
have an idea.
You're bringing this investigation in here based on and are utilizing opinions and information provided by prosecutors and agents who may be just as biased as the people that we're investigating. We just don't know because we hadn't seen their texts, we hadn't seen their emails. Normally, if putting back on my felony judge hat, if a jury is going to make a decision on guilt or innocence of a felony of say a presidential nominee, I'm going to let them ask the jury panel, did you vote for this person? Did you give money to this person? Did you have a bumper sticker for this person? Did you put a sign in their yard? Did you talk this person up? And yet you're coming in here, you don't know if these people you were relying on actually had any biases like the very ones you were investigating. Well, let me ask you this. Among the supervising special agents you referenced and the prosecutors, do you have any idea of the percentage that may have voted for Hillary Clinton?
We did not ask people.
Well, let me tell you, I know my friend Mr. Nadler had referenced, said, oh, you know, a big organization like that's probably just as many people supported Trump. When I heard Newt Gingrich yesterday said the fact is 97% of the people in the DOJ that donated to Democrats. 97%. So there's a good chance that the people that you're relying on did support Hillary Clinton. We don't know because you haven't asked. It's important to know who the investigators are and the people you're relying on. You mentioned in here in the report about Strzok and the relationship that he mentions with Judge Contreras. Do you know why Judge Contreras was removed from the Mike Flynn case?
I don't know why he was recused.
Or is that something you would investigate?
It's not within the scope of this investigation, is it?
Well, I'm going to reinforce the request for the identities of the supervising special agent, the prosecutors and agents that were only identified by numbers, and ask who they contributed to, if anyone, in the last 2 cycles. Now, in your report, you said the SSA told us that the FBI did not consider Pagliano as a subject or someone to prosecute in connection, but this guy set up the unsecured server, as I understood it. This is the guy that you had a lay-down case, or the DOJ did, and yet they don't use that leverage. They don't treat him like they did Manafort or any of these other people. The DOJ had leverage, and this is where bias came into play. They didn't go after him. You said the SSA told us he believed Combetta should have been charged with false statements, yet nobody charged him. And why? Because bias played a role. I understand when you have an investigation, you like to give something, a little something to both sides, makes you feel good. You gave us hundreds of pages of bias, but the conclusion was just, I'm sorry, whether it was subconscious or conscious, you had a little throwaway to go to the Democrats. but the fact is bias is all the way through this, and I'm sorry that you were not able to see that with what is very obvious from your evidence. I go back.
Gentleman's to reverse her server.
Knowledge that classified information actually did transit through her server.
All right.
Because of the absence of markings.
Well, the questions I have for you are equally applicable, whether the missing intent is knowledge or intent. Can you think of a better way to determine what an actor knew than to ask the actor what he or she knew? Am I missing some better repository of evidence than to actually interview the target or the suspect yourself?
I would say there could be instances where there would be better evidence, like contemporaneous recordings, as opposed to the interview where the person might not be candid. But
I'm not aware of those in this case, but perhaps you know something I do not.
No, I'm not. But I'm just saying, you asked hypothetically, is there a better way to get evidence of someone's state of mind?
Given the evidentiary restrictions in this case,
correct.
Can you think of any better way to resolve that issue of knowledge than to actually interview the target herself?
No, I think you would want to interview the target herself.
All right. And what would you ask the target? You were a highly decorated federal prosecutor from one of the most prestigious districts in the country. What would you ask the defendant if you were trying to determine whether or not that person, that suspect, had knowledge?
Well, you'd certainly want to start at the beginning, which is, why did the server come to be set up? What was the rationale behind it? What did you understand it would be used for? Questions like that. Because so much of it would be focused on what the intent, rationale, thinking was behind creating your own separate server or domain name from the outset.
If multiple explanations had been given in the past on that very issue, would you ask the suspect or the target to reconcile those different explanations?
Presumably you would ask the subject during the interview in any area where there might be differing reports of testimony or recollections.
If there have been false exculpatory statements made in connection with the fact pattern, would you ask the target or the suspect to explain those false exculpatory statements?
I think if you were interviewing any witness, you would want to ask them about information that was out there that would suggest there was a false exculpatory.
When I use the phrase consciousness of wrongdoing, what does that mean to you?
That means you have an awareness, perhaps unstated, that the conduct that you've engaged in is wrongful in some way.
What about concealment?
Well, that can mean, I guess, different things depending on the nature of the concealment. It can be active, it can be passive at some level, but it's keeping something from somebody else. And, we have a concern here about concealment on what happened in connection with July 5th.
How about the destruction of evidence?
Again, that can be personal, or it can be knowing that someone else is going to do it, but it is obviously destroying evidence or information that has evidentiary value.
I guess what I'm kind of struggling with a little bit, I was actually asked over the weekend whether or not I think she should have been charged. I can't answer that question because I don't think she was interviewed properly. And it's very difficult to go back and conduct a proper interview after one has already been botched. Did you see all of the questions that you and I just went over in the 302? Were all of those asked of her during that July interview?
I think one of the concerns that's been raised is that a 302 only being a summary of what was said, that there isn't a transcript or other more definitive report on precisely all the questions and answers. So we have a summary, and that's what we're working off of that. It's an extensive summary, but it's still not a transcript.
Well, given the fact that you and I agree that actually talking to the witness, the suspect, the target might be, absent a contemporaneous recording, some of the better evidence on knowledge and intent, how in the hell was Jim Comey able to draft an exoneration press release 6 weeks before that interview took place?
I think it's clear from looking at what we uncovered that by that point in time, they had largely concluded what they had concluded.
But my question is, if what you're missing was knowledge and or intent, and the single best repository for that evidence is the person you've yet to talk to, how in the hell can you make that conclusion?
I think I'll give you what the answer was that we got back, which was, of course, we kept open the possibility that we would find some evidence that would change that view. That was the explanation we were given.
If that were true, did you find drafts of inculpatory press releases?
No, we did not.
You found no memos or drafts where he had decided to charge her?
That's correct. We were told, by the way, by the prosecutors, as you see here, that they did not draft anything until after the interview, precisely because they wanted to wait before making a final judgment for the interview.
Isn't that what we normally do? Wait until the last interview is... It's my last question I'll have for you. Back when you did trial work, do you remember the judge ever admonishing the jury that you are not to make up your mind until the last witness has testified and the last piece of evidence has been introduced? Do you remember a jury ever being told that by a judge?
Not only do I remember that as a prosecutor, but I actually served on a jury last year, so I remember that from the judge's instruction.
It's kind of one of the basic precepts of our justice system is that you wait until it's over before you draw a conclusion. And I am just dumbfounded that Director Comey would draft a press release and cite the missing element when the single best repository of potential evidence on that element had yet to be talked to. I find that stunning.
Trey, I have to hand it to you on this one. You got this one totally right. They drafted that report on finding Hillary not guilty of doing anything. They didn't do any recordings. They didn't take any notes. They just did a summary. Her lawyers were in the room that worked for her at the State Department, then became her lawyers at home. The whole thing is botched. I can't even believe some of the things that came out of this hearing. And the media is just, they're all over this immigration thing to hide what's going on here. We know what's going on. And Horowitz, he's covering some huge asses right now. And he's probably going to be losing his job too, because he ain't pulling the wagon on this one. He's covering up a lot of shit. And I can't see he did really any investigation other than sit down and write a bunch of legal terms and words that have nothing to do with what really happened. And yeah, it was biased.
And from the Amazon jungles to the streets of Shalimar, Florida, I've had a chance to observe the patriotic service of many frontline FBI agents, and I'm in violent agreement with Director Wray that the information in your report does not in any way impugn the incredible work that they do. Refresh my recollection. We know who Lisa Page is. She sent all these bad text messages about Donald Trump, but we don't know who FBI agents 1 through 5 are. Why the disparate treatment?
So when we write up our report, we apply Privacy Act and other laws to decide whose name we can disclose and whose name on balance we think is a legal matter we can't. That's why you see some names in here and some names anonymized. We have the request from the committee. As I mentioned, we sought to get approval from the FBI to send that information forward.
What was the reason the FBI gave you as to why we couldn't learn who FBI agents 1 through 5 are?
They mentioned a couple of reasons, but the primary reason was that because those individuals, 2 of them were agents, one's a lawyer, work on counterintelligence matters, they had a security and safety.
Peter Strzok worked on counterintelligence matters, and we know who he is.
That's correct.
Why the disparate treatment?
I'm just telling you what was reported to us, and as I...
Who's attorney number 2?
I have to think about who that is, but I'd want to make sure that what I was saying wasn't putting someone in jeopardy or at risk. And
what was the reason the FBI gave for not telling us who attorney number 2 is?
Same reason, that individual works on counterintelligence matters and safety and security reasons, as well as some other reasons.
What were they? I want to obtain the full universe of reasons, because I feel as though sunshine, transparency will be the way to root out this bias that we seem to see reflected. Are you familiar with the resistance movement in this country?
I am familiar with it from looking at some of these text messages, but I am not personally.
What's your general
familiar with it.
understanding of what that movement is?
I just can tell you what it says here. Somehow, resist what's going on in the country in terms of the government, governance. I have no real personal knowledge.
Does it mean resist Donald Trump?
Yeah, obviously doesn't read the fucking newspaper, does he?
Played out.
So you've got Peter Strzok, who goes from the Hillary Clinton email investigation to the FBI Trump-Russia investigation to the Mueller probe. You've got Lisa Page, who goes from the Hillary Clinton email investigation to the FBI Russia investigation to the Mueller probe. And then you have attorney number 2, who similarly goes from the Hillary Clinton email investigation to the Trump-Russia investigation to the Mueller probe. It seems like a very bizarre coincidence that the way people tended to end up on the Mueller probe was some association with Hillary Clinton. Whether it was the people I just identified, or whether it was Andrew Weissman, who attended Hillary Clinton's election night party, or whether it was Jeannie Rhee, who had defended the Clinton Foundation in FOIA defenses. It seems so bizarre that the people you would go and accumulate to prosecute the President of the United States and investigate him would be so intertangled with these fact patterns regarding Hillary Clinton. Does that strike you as odd?
I don't know if it strikes me as odd, other than I know it as to the 3 individuals you mentioned occurred.
Is that usual for someone who's like directly tied to one element of a fact pattern to then migrate over to these other investigations?
It's an excellent point, Congressman. We actually make that here as well, that from a management matter, having done corruption cases, you wouldn't put someone who just investigated an individual on one side to go investigate the other person.
Who made those staffing decisions?
Would have been the leadership of the FBI.
So it would have been James Comey who's been fired. It would have been Andrew McCabe, who has been referred for criminal prosecution as a consequence of your good work. Attorney number 2 says, "Viva la resistance," while actively investigating President Trump. Is that right?
That's my understanding.
And does it trouble you that someone who was tasked with investigating the president was associating himself with a resistance movement against the very same president?
I'll say what I said earlier. I don't care who that person was investigating. That person should not be making comments about an individual or related to a person they're investigating or the FBI is working with.
Well, it will be totally unacceptable to my constituents to say that there was a person who went from the Hillary Clinton email investigation to the Trump-Russia investigation to the Mueller probe, who identified himself and who you identified as the lead FBI lawyer on the Mueller probe, and we don't get to know who that person is. Associating with the resistance, going after the president after this totally botched Hillary Clinton email investigation that you've appropriately highlighted. In this country, we cannot live in a world where unelected people at the FBI get to shelter someone who I believe was actively working against the president and actively associating and identifying with a movement that is intended to frustrate everything that this president is trying to do. So I hope we get that information, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gates is another one that's a real big hero. Him and Jordan and Gomer and Meadows and Nunes, and we've got some really good Republicans fighting for this country, and they're standing up for Trump. I knew they would once they realized that President Trump is not a politician. He's a man that has integrity and honesty, and he may be rough around the edges, but damn, I'll tell you what, he's doing wonders with this country. And these guys back here trying to backstab and roll over Trump, those are your swamp creatures. That's Chuck and Nancy and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and Coons and Nadler and Mendez. I mean, I've yet to find one Democrat worth voting for. In all of those, they are just so vile. Sheila Jackson, Frederica, whatever the hell her name was. These are some awful people. Look at what they've done to the government. And, the sad part is all this shit leads right back to Obama's front door. These guys didn't do this on their own. They got their marching orders from somebody, and that somebody is President Obama.
There's going to be people making comments.
Comments, of course, they're going to make comments.
So that's, I'm just hesitant to say.
It would seem to me in this environment, it would stick in your mind if anybody happened to make a comment indicating they wanted President Trump to win. Do you ever remember any comments like that from any of these emails?
I don't remember anything as I sit here.
Okay. Several of these people were involved in more than one investigation, which kind of concerns me. Was it a coincidence that people who had an anti-Trump bias wound up in 2 separate investigations or 3 separate investigations?
Well, what we describe here is the decision was made in July after the Clinton investigation was closed in Director Comey's announcement and the Attorney General's announcement when the Russia matter opened to take some of those same members and put them on that next investigation, which we stayed is, from a management standpoint, something we would be thought was...
Was it a coincidence, though, they happened to be Clinton partisans? I guess that's my concern. Of all these seas of FBI people, we're told they're so professional, is it a coincidence that people who have so brazenly expressed anti-Trump sentiment would wind up on these 2 key political investigations?
Well, just keep in mind, these texts aren't discovered till 2017 when we start our review. So
right, I understand that, but what do you think was... It hits me as unusual, given the huge volume of work the FBI has to do, that these clearly anti-Trump people wound up on these 2 politically charged investigations. No?
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, General Horowitz. I have a very high regard for you. I think you know that. Your report states that various witnesses told you that the mishandling of classified information was a persistent practice of the State Department, and that the State Department was so screwed up in the handling of classified information that if they'd wanted to prosecute Secretary Clinton, that they'd had to prosecute 150 State Department people. Does that basically invalidate the statute?
It doesn't. That's what they told us was one of their rationales for.
Well, I don't know if you're going to allow me to do this with you, but I want to do this in regard to the statement of an insurance policy, okay? It's not in regard to the Russia probe. I know that's coming later. But obviously, Andrew McCabe put Peter Strzok in charge of the Russia probe. Are you aware that Strzok went to London in July of 2016?
I've learned of that through various public reports.
And I think it would be fair to say that McCabe approved that trip and approved the expenditures for that.
I don't know the answer one way or the other.
I just wonder if what other justification there could have been for a trip to London at that particular time other than the Russia probe. And what concerns me was that when he returned, he almost immediately launched that probe. That McCabe, I think, approved him going to London. He came back and he launched it. Do you think there's any possibility that Strzok had prior knowledge that Christopher Steele was assembling the dossier?
You know, that's one of the issues we have been asked to look at, and so we're in the middle of that work on how that played out with regard to the FISA application.
And I'm glad that you made that point, because I think another question I need to ask, was there any possibility that the dossier was at least part of Strzok's insurance policy? Because that statement came later, I believe.
Right, the insurance policy statement came up on
Well, here's what concerns me about it, is that you've got McCabe, whose wife received almost $700,000 in campaign contributions from the Clintons, which was almost 40% of her total campaign contributions. And obviously there was a very strong relationship. McCabe put Strzok in charge of this. He either sent Strzok to London or allowed him to go, or approved it. Do you think that either of them had knowledge that the Clinton campaign paid for the dossier?
I don't know the answer as I sit here, but that is something as part of the review that we're doing. It will be touched on.
The gentlelady from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Mr. Horowitz, for being here. A January 14th, 2016 letter from IG Charles McCullough discusses sworn declarations that dozens of Secretary Clinton's emails were top secret and special access program levels. This information, as you well know, is so sensitive that even for IG McCullough, he had to get special clearance in order to even see them. Treating information like this improperly would almost certainly have resulted in serious consequences for just about anybody, not in this situation. this letter from I.G. McCullough, was out well before Comey changed the May memo language from, quote, gross negligence to extremely careless. And since we have a lot of viewers watching this, and we tend to in this committee, both of these committees, be very legalese, could you describe for everyone the difference between those two phrases?
Well, gross negligence is a legal term found in Section 793, whereas extremely careless is a non-legal term to describe, or as used here by former Director Comey, to describe what his characterization was of the conduct.
So, did I hear you correctly that there's really nothing in the U.S. Code that deals with, quote, extreme carelessness or extremely careless when it comes to handling classified information?
Correct.
Okay. So, information classified at this level contains very critical information, critical to national security, protecting the identity of U.S. intelligence assets. Is it possible that Comey chose extremely careless or extreme carelessness precisely because of the fact that that phrase is not in the U.S. Code?
In fact, that's what we were told is the reason for the change was to take it from what was in the statute to something outside the statute.
Well, thank you. I think all of us on the committee and those watching appreciate that clarity. I want to follow up on something that Chairman Gowdy brought up earlier, and that has to do with the interview process. Secretary Clinton was voluntarily interviewed rather than appearing before the grand jury.
That's correct.
Were Secretary Clinton's attorneys, Mr. Mills and Samuelson, I believe their names, were present for that interview?
There were multiple lawyers present, including Ms. Mills and Ms. Samuelson.
Mills and Samuelson, interesting. Were they not also witnesses in this investigation?
They were.
It would strike me that's a little bit unusual to have witnesses a party to an interview with the subject of the investigation.
Which is why we found that it was not consistent with normal investigative practice, and actually Director Ray yesterday also suggested that.
Was that interview recorded?
It was not.
Why?
The FBI, as a matter of its practice, does not record interviews of witnesses.
Is that one of your recommendations to change that? I would hope so.
We actually don't have that in a recommendation. That's been a subject of discussion for many, many years within the Justice Department.
So there was a written report?
There was a written summary report of the interview.
Oh, so only a summary. So when I read your report, the IG report, that the decision not to prosecute Secretary Clinton was essentially made prior to her interview. Did I read that correctly?
What we were told is, absent a confession or a false statement, the plan was to close the investigation immediately after the interview.
So, if the decision not to prosecute was largely made prior to even talking to her, how could it, and there's been all of the discussion today about whether or not she had willful knowledge and intent, how could anybody even know if she had willful intent or knowledge if they didn't talk with her before they made the decision? And then secondly, with the conversation and what we now know is the very extreme bias, particularly of Strzok and several other agents who, as I read the report, were part of that investigation, how can anyone really be sure that there wasn't bias in the way that interview was conducted? When it went to the prosecutorial decision.
And what we went and looked at was the summary and the preparation that went into the interview to see whether the questions that were intended to be asked were in fact asked.
Get down.
During that, in terms of whether individuals who were in the room were biased or expressed bias.
This should be all over the news.
There's absolutely no idea.
We wouldn't know one way or the other, although I would, say Mr. Strzok was in the room, but not one of the questioners, and we had concerns about his text messages, and one of the two questioners was one of the other three individuals we've referenced here as with problematic text messages.
Very disturbing. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Well, there you have it, folks. That's the top 35 minutes of 7 hours today and yesterday's hearing. I'd like to have added more, but 36 minutes is a lot to watch and catch on to. But I think it's pretty damning. The IG report has bias written all through it from the FBI and the D.O.J., but Horowitz won't cross that line. I don't know why. I think he probably is trying to cover their asses. And Mr. President, I think you're going to need another Attorney General, because this boy is definitely not 100% honest. He avoided a lot of really good questions and just took up air in the room with bullshit answers. But anyway, Democrats are going to underplay this, and mainstream media will probably not carry any of this. But I wanted to send a thank you out to Congresswoman Handler. I think she was the last one on this video. You did a great job, and you're correct, lady. These guys are covering their asses everywhere they can. They're throwing out 5 sacrificial lambs when it should be about 15 of them. And former President Barack Obama should be called before Congress to testify too. And Valerie Jarrett and Loretta Lynch and all Obama's administration, basically. It seems like the whole damn thing's been corrupt, and I hope we vote good in November, guys. I hope we vote out some more Democrats, because that's all they want to do is keep the swamp intact. I mean, keep their fingers in that pie of money and strangling the American people, you know, because if we're low, then they can control us. But if we got money and property, they can't control us. And this is the perfect opportunity to make sure we do some house cleaning and help out our president. Vote Republican. Vote good Republicans, not phony rhinos. Do some research. Do some vetting. And make sure you vote right. Get informed. Quit listening to mainstream media. Man, they've been packing our asshole full of shit this last 2 years. I don't know how anybody can watch them and not laugh in their face to begin with. But anyway, this is the end of the video. And like I said, we've got some really good Republicans digging deep on this. We need to back them up. Let's get them some more seats. Let's get them a super majority in the House and the Senate so we can help President Trump. He's doing everything he can. It's our turn to step up to the plate.